I've been thinking about Roger Zelazny a lot this week, more so than usual, but I do think about him often. He's a writer that's beguiled me for some time. I've picked up a lot of his work very cheaply, secondhand, which is something you can do pretty easily if you go to any secondhand bookseller. There's going to be some Zelazny paperbacks, just like there's going to be Silverberg paperbacks, just like there's going to be Robin Hobb paperbacks. And I've filled up quite a collection of them for probably less than about $30, which is pretty great. But 2 Octobers ago, I read A Night in Lonesome October, which is his sort of day by day in October. Every chapter is like a day is a day on the calendar, sort of account of these Victorian monsters, and so it's this Lovecraftian kind of plot that's occurring in the background in their world. And I thought it was a cute book. It really did remind me quite a bit of like a proto Alan Moore, Kevin O'Neill, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen type thing. But it was slight and mostly kind of unmemorable, except for like a middle period in the book where he kind of does a Lovecraft pastiche of like Lovecraft's dream cycle, which I thought was really cool and well written. And it kind of harkens back to like some of the strengths that I think sort of serves Zelazny better as a writer and are maybe more apparent in the book I'm reviewing this week, This Immortal. So I have been wanting to read this for some time, mostly on the strength of it tying with Dune for the Best Novel Award at the 1966 Hugos. If you're unfamiliar with the Hugo Awards, in short, it's like the Oscars of science fiction and fantasy books. And they've been giving them out since the 50s, and they still give them out today. And they're probably even more recognized today because they get slapped on a lot of books with stickers like, best novel Hugo winner, that kind of thing. But what fascinated me most particularly about this is that this was Zelazny's debut novel after he had spent a bit of time moonlighting as a writer, mostly short stories, while still working at the Social Security Administration. And Zelazny's sort of centralized interest as a writer were both poetry and Greek myth, or actually really mythology in general, and classical mythology. So with This Immortal, he combined these two interests, and it sort of gave the pathway for him to create his very first book, which was serialized in magazines for a time under the title And Call Me Conrad, but when it was collected as one whole novel, it was entitled This Immortal. Now, This Immortal and Dune are completely different types of books, as I will discuss here briefly. You don't need to hear me talk about Dune. You know everything about Dune you need to know. But This Immortal, that it tied with it in Best Novel, is really fascinating because we have a situation where one of these books is one of the most influential science fiction novels of all time that has like driven film and television shows and other books and the like. And the other is, while Zelazny's well known within science fiction circles, it's kind of a forgotten novel. And I wanted to read it to get a sense of why it was forgotten. Is it unjustly? Or maybe it really should be sort of tossed into the cultural waste bin. So let's talk a little bit about This Immortal. The story takes place on a post-apocalyptic Earth centuries after nuclear devastation called the 3 Days has left much of the planet a radioactive wasteland. Many humans have abandoned Earth for the colonies of the alien Vegans, who now treat our ravaged world as a sort of tourist attraction, visiting the ruins of our civilization. Now, our protagonist in this novel is a fellow named Konrad Nomikos, who is an arts commissioner for the Department of Arts, Archives, and Monuments, I think I got that right, in the Egyptian office for this particular bureaucracy. And Conrad's kind of a fascinating character. He is seemingly immortal, though the novel kind of keeps the nature of his immortality a bit vague. He might be a legendary resistance fighter from centuries past that gets referenced often throughout the book. And he might also be the Greek god Pan. So if you're keeping track at home, we have the following things: a post-apocalypse with mutants, kind of Mad Maxy type stuff, aliens who might be operating and pulling strings behind the scenes, political intrigue between the aliens, the remaining humans, and those who live out on the colonies of the Vegan worlds, and lastly, Greek gods might be real. And it's all done over 180 pages. And it's this densely layered mega plot that's occurring in the background of the novel that I think really sort of underscored my own struggle with what Zelazny was trying to do over such a short amount of time. The actual story centers on Conrad being employed to take an alien from that same earlier alien race named Court on a tour of the world as a tourist, though it's later revealed that he's actually trying to write a book that might involve the potential sale of Earth to the vegan race, or the vegan race. See, this is what happens when modern day conceptions take over these books. You're like, oh, is it vegan or vegan? Because you only see it as vegan most of the time. Anyway, and so on top of that, this tour is happening, but a lot of Conrad's colleagues and friends from his department as well as his own personal life join him on this tour. And things happen. Eventually you get to sort of a Heart of Darkness kind of end. And all of this combines for what's kind of a pretty messy, difficult read. Now, I don't really have problems necessarily jumping into the deep end of any sort of science fiction or fantasy or genre work in general. Sometimes I admire that because I think that heightens the realism of what you're sort of being absorbed into. But I don't think Zelazny's storytelling style, which is kind of laconic and a bit sardonic even, necessarily is served well by this overloaded premise. I think he had a lot of ideas here, and I think it was one of the things, like, you could feel the energy as he's writing it, and you could think, oh man, I want to do this, and I want to do this, and I want to do this. And he just didn't really self-edit himself so well, to the point where I think anything lands with any particular precision. It's a good, not great book. I know it sounds like I'm just saying negative things about it, but in truth, it's an enjoyable read the further along you get. I think particularly as, again, this Heart of Darkness sort of Lost City of Z aspect kind of kicks in towards the back end, I found it to be a much more intriguing book. But it's a difficult book to describe and a harder book to sell to people. I tried to describe this to my girlfriend yesterday as I wrestled with my feelings about the book and how I was going to take a video about it and what was my take going to be and how would I sort of center my review. And the more I told her about it, the more she said, oh, this sounds awful. This sounds so bad. And I can see why. Maybe I'm just that bad at describing it, or maybe the book just isn't that good. But the truth of the matter is, I can understand why this book has sort of been left to the cultural wasteland where Dune has continued to thrive. And it's not just because they've made movies of Dune. It's because one has a way that it impacts readers right away, and it has cut deeper through sort of the pop culture landscape. And the other is just a book that has way too much going on that really nobody can wrap their heads around in any truly effective way unless you're just a big Zelazny or New Wave partisan. And I don't even think that there's like a great print version of this book available. At least there wasn't for a while. iBooks has kind of like what looks like sort of a junky kind of print-on-demand version, maybe. I didn't want to buy that, but I read it in the Library of America's American Science Fiction selection of the 1960s, which is a really cool collection. It's got This Immortal, but it's also got books like Samuel R. Delaney's Nova, which is talk about a great space opera, as well as books I haven't read like Way Station by Clifford Simak and High Crusade, and R.A. Lafferty's Pastmaster, another one that I am looking forward to checking out. So if nothing else, I got to dig into this a little bit, which is pretty cool. Bottom line on This Immortal, I'm not mad I read it, really. I know it sounds like I have a lot of issues with it, but I do think Zelazny's evocative writing helps quite a bit. I think that he has, at least you can feel the overwhelming talent that's being sort of shuttered by just a little too much energy all at once. And it's really more of a case of, oh, this food is terrible and the portions are so small, I guess. But I think it is a proof of concept for works that I will read soon that I think are probably more critically acclaimed and have sort of lasted the test of time, particularly something like Lord of Light, which takes the same sort of mythological concept that there are mythological classic beasts and gods and all of this, and tied it to sort of science fictional ideas. So I'm going to be generous. I'm going to give this book 3 stars, and perhaps as the months go on, my feelings towards it may soften. I can already kind of get the sense that there is something here, but it's not necessarily a book that I can recommend for a lot of people, especially when I know that there is better work of Zelazny's right around the corner. Hey, why not? Let's do a bonus review just because I've got the extra time, and you want to get a video over 10 minutes to keep in the YouTube algorithm. So over the holiday, I read Michael Moorcock's Behold the Man, which is a book that I've sort of held off on for some time, only because its ending was ruined for me by someone on Reddit, and I thought, well, if I know the ending, I'm not in any great hurry to read it. But I don't know, there was something about the Christmas season and this sort of liturgical book about Jesus that I thought just felt like a sort of perfect tie-in. So I read it, and I've got to say, it's really good. Man, it's really good, and I regret not reading it sooner. So the idea behind Behold the Man is that a time traveler named Carl Glogauer has traveled back to the days of Jesus and John the Baptist, and he's actually discovered by followers of John the Baptist. He's dragged back to John the Baptist's camp, and John kind of nurses him back to health, and he keeps asking him, hey, where's Jesus? I want to see Jesus. And John's like, I don't know who Jesus is. Well, you'll never guess what happens, guys. Even though you really see the ending coming, and it's not a spoiler to even mention it, but I just won't. But like, even though you absolutely know within probably about 20 to 30 pages that the ending is exactly what you think it's going to be, it hits pretty hard, and it's an incredibly well-written book. What I like most about it is that it alternates from Carl's experiences in sort of the late BC period and sort of the end days of Christ and the Roman Empire, and his own life in present day leading up to entering that time machine. And so you get these little vignettes about Carl as a child and Carl's first sort of experiences with sexual abuse and his relationships with women. And it's a really, really cool portrait of sort of a mid-60s bachelor who is trying to sort of understand who he is and his own place in the world, and really understand his own sort of theological and scientific level of thought. It also reminded me, to be blunt, of something I wrote myself about a year and a half ago, one of my own short stories, and to find that Michael Moorcock had already used a very similar device was very heartening for me, because it made me feel like I was on the right track with this story. So that made it a very fun read. And I will say too, the other thing about Behold the Man is that while there's some books in between Stormbringer, which was sort of the first end to the Elric saga, and this book, I think there's about, I want to say, about a 2-year to 3-year difference in the publishing dates, though they were kind of written in closer proximity than the publishing dates indicate, probably. The writing is completely leveled up. Like, I thought Stormbringer was a book that felt like a bunch of short stories kind of not that well welded together. They're held together by sticks and glue, it felt like. Whereas Behold the Man is, despite being just barely above novella length, really feels like a cohesive whole. And to me, feels like maybe the first great Moorcock work. And I'm so glad I read it, because now it kind of juices me to want to read more books that came out either right after it or some of like the next great books like Gloriana, which won the World Fantasy Award. So now I am well on board with reading more of my Moorcock books, which, as you can see, is the Moorcock Rainbow behind me. So I'm going to give that one 4.5 stars. I think it's a really excellent work and highly recommend it to you, not even just in the Christmas season, provided you feel like it would potentially be blasphemous to read, though I could understand how in the late 60s this was a very controversial book. So with that warning aside, I definitely recommend Michael Moorcock's Behold the Man. All right, that's 2. We'll see you next week. Everybody be good.